folks, Marco of Rhyze Mushrooms here. Just a little video to show you how to use our cultivator kit, which is like a little box that comes with everything you need to start growing oyster mushrooms at home. It's a bit more involved than our grow boxes. With this kit you actually make your own grow bags with some spawn and some substrate that we provide. So the things that you'll need to do this are obviously the kit that is available on our website, as well as a measuring jug full of water. If you have some scales are useful, but they're not essential. And either some cable ties or some rubber bands or hair bands or a piece of string. And a mask, a relatively clean surface work area, so like a kind of clean kitchen counter would be ideal. And yeah, that's everything you need. To get started, you want to be working in like the cleanest conditions kind of possible. Whenever you're cultivating mushrooms, you want to try and, you're creating like a damp, nutritious, hospitable environment for, in this case, our oyster mushrooms, but there's a lot of other microorganisms that thrive in those conditions. So you're basically trying to, during what we call the inoculation, which is the actual process of introducing the fungus to your new substrate, during that process it's really important to try and minimize how many other microorganisms are being introduced to a substrate. Like our breath, our skin, our clothes, the surfaces around us are all potential vectors of contamination because these microorganisms exist all around us. They're, we have very complex, invisible ecosystems of these microorganisms, where we want to try and minimize the amount, that that our substrate is exposed to them. So things that help are, cleaning your work surface and all your tools beforehand. If you have some kind of surface cleaner, like a Dettol antibacterial spray, that's ideal, or any kind of generic surface cleaner. You want to wash your hands with warm soapy water, or hand sanitizer, and ideally wear a mask as well. So I'm going to put my mask on now. Right, so the grow kit consists of substrate, which in this case is straw pellets. So straw is a really great substrate for growing oyster mushrooms. It's not very prone to contamination, and it's nutritionally got everything oyster mushrooms love to grow on. Straw pellets like these are particularly good substrate for beginners, because in the process of pelletizing the straw, of compressing it into these little pellets, most of the microorganisms that would naturally be in the straw are killed. And because it's such a dry substrate as well, it's also not very hospitable place for microorganisms. So it tends to be it's very clean and very easy to use. So the first thing we need to do is divide the straw pellets into 3. So this kit has everything you need to make 3 grow bags. You don't have to make all 3 at once. You could do it in do one and then another and then another, or in whatever order you like. So we have 1.5 kilos of straw pellets here. I'm going to divide it into 3 bags with 500 grams each. I've got my scales here. I'm going to use this jar to hold the bag, just to make it a little bit easier to pour. But if you can use something else, or you can just use your hands. So yeah, I'm going to tare my scales. If you don't have scales at home, don't worry. This does not have to be super precise. We're dividing everything into thirds. So basically you can try and eyeball a third of this bag if you don't have scales. If you do have scales, then you're aiming to measure 500 grams of pellets in each bag. So that's my first bag full of pellets. Just going to tuck it closed like that for now while I'm not using it, to minimize the amount of airborne contaminants that can fall into it. I'm going to measure out my second bag. I've got about 500 grams of pellets in my 3 bags. Now I'm going to divide the spawn in 3. So this is 300 grams of spawn, so you want 100 grams in each bag. Again, you can either use scales or just eyeball it. I'm going to break up the spawn a little bit to make it easier to pour. So this spawn is what we call grain spawn. So it's the the mycelium of oyster mushrooms growing on grain. You'll either get this on bird seed like this, which is a bunch of different smaller grains, mostly millet, and then, or we also make spawn on rye grain, which is a bigger grain. So I'm just going to pop these bags back on the scale, zero it, and measure 100 grams. So once you've got your dry ingredients separated into 3 bags, you just want to basically mix them up. So you want to end up with this spawn as evenly mixed through the substrate as you can, and you also want to try and break up any of the kind of bigger nuggets of spawn, so you have like as many individual inoculation points as possible. The more like individual grains spread out across the substrate and the more evenly spread out they are, the faster your substrate will myceliate. So I'm just going to break it up with my fingers inside the bag and just massage the bag to try to get the spawn mixed through. You kind of like work it from the bottom up, tends to mix fairly well. Pretty well mixed through. The next thing I'm going to do is add the water. So yeah, mushrooms are, most mushrooms are around like 90% water, and most of that water comes from inside the substrate. So by total mass, most of the substrate will end up actually being water. So we've got 500 grams of pellets in each bag, and we're going to add 800 milliliters of water to each bag. I'm going to use the scales to measure the water because 1 milliliter of water is 1 gram. So scales are actually often easier and more accurate to use than measuring cups. The water I've got here is pretty warm. It's the middle of winter right now, and the tap water is freezing cold, and most people's houses are really cold. And using like relatively kind of lukewarm water can help give your mushrooms a head start by kind of actually putting them in a relatively warm substrate. So this is definitely not hot water. You don't want to use hot water, that'll kill the mycelium. This is kind of a mixture of boiled water and freezing cold tap water, which is now, yeah, basically kind of like maybe 25 degrees or something, lukewarm. So I'm going to add 800 milliliters of water to each bag. Alright, and then as soon as I've added the water, I'm going to seal the bag. So here you use a cable tie or a hairband or a piece of string, and you're going to seal the bag at the top, and I'm going to make sure to seal the bag above the filter patches. So we have some different types of bags here. These ones have these long zipper style filter patches. These ones have these little round window ones, but you want to make sure that you seal the bag above the filter patch, you know, so that the filter patches can be used effectively, so that for gas exchange, so the mushrooms can breathe. Pretty quickly, these straw pellets are going to swell up as they absorb the water. I'll just leave that there for now. We'll do the other ones. That's my bags pretty much made. I'm just gonna label them with today's date, which is the 15th. And the species, which is Pearl Oyster. Yeah, it's good to keep track of you know, the species and the date of inoculation, so you can monitor the progress, and kind of becomes more important when you start to grow a lot of different mushrooms and doing multiple inoculations. But it's kind of a good habit to get into. After you've made your bags, you're going to want to put them to incubate. So that's basically I can take my mask off now because the bags are sealed, so don't have to be so worried about hygiene anymore. Yeah, you want to put them to incubate. Incubation is the phase of the cultivation cycle where you basically are trying to encourage the mycelium to grow. So the mycelium in nature would be growing inside a tree. For oyster mushrooms, it likes to grow in dark, warm, stable conditions. So the ideal temperature is kind of, you know, so-called room temperature. Not many rooms are that temperature in Scotland, but like 22 to 25 degrees. I find that the best place in my house for that would be the cupboard where my boiler is, because it's kind of has a relatively constant temperature because the boiler is running. Yeah, and they need to be in the dark, but that doesn't mean you have to put them like in a cupboard or something. You can just like throw a cloth over them and put them in a bag to exclude light. But yeah, basically want to put them somewhere nice and toasty. And then usually after about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how warm the space is, the bags should be myceliated and look something like this. So you have the mycelium growing throughout the whole bag, at which point they'd be ready to fruit. At that, when they look something like this or even whiter, you're going to want to take them out of that warm, dark place and cut a hole in the bag to encourage fruiting. So I did this earlier actually with a Stanley knife. So I just cut like an X here. I chose a spot where it looked like there was quite a lot of mycelium kind of starting to form denser clumps. And yeah, you want to then, for the fruiting phase, you know, you're moving from conditions that mycelium like to grow in to the conditions that mushrooms like to grow in, which are cooler, much damper, and breezy. But usually I just recommend to people just put these on their kitchen counters and make sure to regularly spray them with water. If your house is really well heated and super dry, you're definitely going to have to do this a lot more. If you live in a drafty, damp tenement, you're probably not going to have to intervene much. You probably have a pretty ideal environment for mushrooms to grow. Yeah, once you've tried growing mushrooms on these straw pellets, you can kind of graduate onto trying to grow mushrooms from household waste. So everything you need to know how to do that is inside the booklet. That's part of the kit. So I would encourage you to harvest your mushrooms, eat them and enjoy them, but then try and keep the stems of all the mushrooms you harvest and use the stems to make your own spawn, and then repeat this process again, but growing on household waste like coffee grounds or cardboard or old clothes, old books. There's all sorts of options which are outlined.